him come the Canaanites. But we find an interesting character here in verses 8 through 12. That's a guy named Nimrod. And it says here that Nimrod became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That's why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ur, Calah, and Rezin, which is between Nineveh and Calah, which is the great city. On the surface, that doesn't sound like he's too bad a guy. But in actuality, this man is the first king of an empire that was against God. And he purposefully led people to reject God. And there's some things. One of the things that we have to look at is what the Jews thought about him. I think I mentioned to you before that the Jews, in a lot of their writings, they knew things about all this stuff in the Old Testament, and they had their traditions and their ideas. And we come into Christianity and we lose a lot of that rich heritage of knowledge of the Old Testament that the Jews have got. Well, some of them looked at this guy Nimrod as an oppressor of the liberties of people. Josephus, who was a historian, says that he is the one who instigated the building of the Tower of Babel. And that's very, very interesting there, and we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. His name, Nimrod, means the rebel. That's what his name means. And he seems to be the first one who, he says he was a mighty hunter. And it's very possible that because there were more animals than there were people, that as the animals were reproducing, that some of them got to be a little more powerful than what people were comfortable with. And so along comes Nimrod, who is this mighty hunter, and he's able to eliminate some of the threats to different places where people are being threatened by animals because they've been increasing. There's not enough people to keep them under control. And so along comes Nimrod, and he ingratiates people to himself because he's this great hunter. Some of the traditions about his hunting were kind of interesting. One of them was kind of far-fetched, but they said that the reason he was such a great hunter was that he wore the skins that God had made for Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve had passed them on, and they've been ended up passed down from generation to generation, just about 2 or 3 generations, from Adam to Noah. And Noah had them with him on the boat, and he passed them on to his children. And so now he's wearing these, and when he would come around the animals, they would see the animal skins, and they wouldn't realize he was a human. And so he was able to kill them. That's a little far-fetched to me. That's got skins lasting for, 1,800 to 2,200 years. I'm not sure that it's going to last that long. Another thing is that it was just a good hunter. He was the grandson of Ham, and he was who was the son of Noah. He had great strength. Josephus said that he's the one who gradually changed the government into tyranny, because he wanted to control them, and he wanted to turn them away from fearing God and make them dependent on himself. And so he begins to build his kingdom, and he goes and he builds all these different cities. But there's some interesting stuff here about him and Abraham. And this I had never, as many times as I've taught through this, I'd never come across this before. But according to the Islamic tradition, Abraham and Nimrod met. In fact, Abraham's father, Terah, Abraham was from that area before he came to Canaan. But Abraham's father, Terah, was one of like a prime minister or something in Nimrod's kingdom. And he then began persecuting people who believed in the true God. And according to the tradition, the Islamic tradition anyway, he kind of had a confrontation with Abraham because Abraham believed in God. And so he threw Abraham into a fiery furnace. And Abraham came out alive. And when he came out alive, Nimrod challenged him to a fight. And so I guess Abraham agreed to it. And the day came. Nimrod had this huge army, and he came out. And Abraham standing there is all by himself. And Nimrod approached him and said, "Where's your army?" And he points to a swarm of gnats, which began to attack Nimrod's entire army, and they ran off and they won the battle. Well, that so infuriated Nimrod that he was embarrassed like that he wanted to fight God, and he challenged God to a fight. Well, God's not going to fight a man, you know that. But if you can see the arrogance of this guy, I think there may be something to this. But the arrogance of, I want to fight you. And so, according to that particular tradition, that was one reason why he built or had people build the Tower of Babel, because, God's up in the heavens and I can't get to him. So he goes to the top of the Tower of Babel, and it's still so much farther. And so according to this tradition, he created this box, a chest they called it, and he somehow attached these 4 either eagles or vultures. They said it could have been either one. 4 vultures to it. So he and his, like his prime minister or whoever, they get into the box and they start flying. That's kind of ridiculous in itself. But this is what, this shows you the heart that this guy's got to attack God. And he went up as high as he could, and they kept looking, and finally they got as high as they could, and so he shot arrows up into the sky trying to kill God. And according to that particular tradition, the arrows got sent back by Gabriel, and he covered them with blood so that Nimrod would think he had succeeded. So Nimrod went on for about 400 years, according to that tradition anyway, and he ruled a very wicked rule. But at the end of the 400 years, God sent an angel to tell Nimrod to repent. And Nimrod refused to repent. And at that point, God sent an army of gnats against him. And one of them flew right up into his head. And it was driving him batty. And so he had somebody strike iron on an anvil so that it would supposedly drive this thing crazy. And he ended up suffering for like 40 years before he died. There are people who feel like, jumping all the way from Genesis into Revelation, there are people who feel like that Nimrod is going to be the Antichrist. And one of the reasons that they feel that is because he was the first one to establish a kingdom that ruled God out totally. And if you can get, I know these stories are probably not true that I just shared with you, but if you can get an image of a man who is a powerful leader on the earth, who is that angry at a God that he can't see, that he would try to shoot arrows at him and he would challenge him to a battle, that temperament is the exact same temperament of the Antichrist, who at the end of the book of Revelation, toward the end of the book of Revelation, gathers with his armies to battle against Christ who comes in the clouds. And so I don't think it's so far-fetched that whether the stories are true or not, they're probably embellished, but that attitude is probably pretty accurate for what was in the heart of Nimrod. And so that leads us right now into chapter 11, where we have the building of the Tower of Babel. And that's interesting. Now, I find it interesting because Saddam Hussein, I think we all remember who he was, but Saddam Hussein was trying to rebuild Babylon. He was trying to put it all back together, had architectural drawings even of the Tower of Babel hanging, and supposedly there are some modern-day architectural structures in Dubai that resemble the stories about the Tower of Babel. I don't know how true that is, but it's thought that the Tower of Babel was not necessarily pitched to the people as outright rebellion. And this fascinated me. It seems that there's a possibility, a guy that I really respect, who is part of the creation movement, if you can call it that. But he wrote some stuff about this. And what he said was that even when they built this, the Tower of Babel, it probably had a temple on the top. And there were like the zodiac symbols were around it. You know, to us, zodiac symbols are like, you know, keep it away from me. You know, I don't believe in that stuff. But this fella, Morris, says that when those symbols originally began to be used, they were reminders of biblical truth that got twisted and perverted. And when he shared that, and you think, okay, maybe they convinced the people to build this because then we can get closer to God. And it tells me that we really need to be careful. And so there's a couple of lessons from the Tower of Babel. First off, beware of charismatic leadership that brings people together to rebel against God. Nimrod, that even in the Hebrew it says he was a mighty hunter, but there was a religious connotation to that he was, and that's why some of the reasons were that I shared those other indications about his life. But secondly, beware of individuals or governments when they concentrate energies in rebelling against God. We're seeing that in our government. We see it around us right now. They get together and they really rebel against the revealed will of God. We've had charismatic leaders who try to make people think it's the right thing to do to rebel against restricting marriage to just a man and a woman. How dare people think that marriage was just... I mean, it's only been that way for, 6,000 years? But to make people think that that's the right thing, and you've got to be so careful of that. But the thing that really hit me was this. Beware of false religious rhetoric or moral premises that influence individuals to rebel against the revealed will of God. Let me read you what Dr. Henry Morris said about that tower. The tower in its lofty grandeur would symbolize the might and majesty of the true God of heaven. A great temple at its top would provide a center and an altar where men could offer their sacrifices and worship God. It sounds reasonable, doesn't it? Yeah. The signs of the zodiac would be emblazoned on the ornate ceiling and the walls of the temple, signifying the great story of creation and redemption as told by the patriarchs from before the flood. These figures, which had once been designed only as symbolic representations of the heaven, on the heavens, of the coming Redeemer and of God's great plan of salvation, now began to take on the aspect of actual spiritual entities. The virgin, whose sign among the stars once reminded men of the promised seed of the woman, began to assume the proportions of an actual queen of heaven. And Leo, the great sidereal lion at the other end of the zodiac, became a great spiritual king of heaven. Soon the stars, the physical hosts of heaven, were invested with the personalities of the angels and the invisible spiritual heavenly host. But it began as what looked like it was good, and it looked like it was right, but then it was twisted. And there's so many things in our world today that if you don't think them through, they look good, they look logical, they look sensible. But the deeper you get into it, you begin to realize, oh, this is not right. This is not what it ought to be. And so back into chapter 11, the people had come together, and there's some really neat things here. Look what God says. They've come together. They want to build a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, make a name for ourselves. They don't want to be scattered over the earth. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they've begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Now there's a powerful lesson there. And here's the lesson. There's power in unity. Power in unity. These people didn't have God on their side, but God said, if they're all together, they're all speaking the same, nothing will be impossible for them. And I really think that if we would take a lesson from this, we could learn so much. There's so many things that aren't as important as we think they are. And we need to put them aside and come together in unity, because when we are unified, marvelous things can happen. And I think it's going to be really important as you guys are preparing for Pastor Brian and Marty to come, that there's unity. Come together. Lay aside any little differences you might have and come together in unity, because if you do, nothing will be impossible for you. And those are the words of God. If these people all speak in the same language, get together, nothing's going to be impossible. So God said, hey, we can't let that happen there. He would let it happen here if you're unified for his purposes. He didn't want it to happen here because they're rebelling against him. And so he says in verse 7, come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. So that brings me to a question. Wonder what the original language was. I'm sure it wasn't English. Although I still have difficulties understanding how anybody could think in a different language than English. I mean, because that's all I think. I think in English, you know. And, you know, this is a pew. It's not a whatever else they might call it. But there was an original language. What it was, I don't know. But they were all speaking it. And so God comes down and he confuses. And I want you to notice something, because there's an image of the Trinity here. And part of what I just read, there is indication of the Trinity. Did any of you pick up on it? Yeah, let us go down. Let us. He doesn't say, I will go down. He says, let us go down, indicating more than one. And of course, it doesn't necessarily say there was three in one, but it's more than one. Let us go down and confuse their language so they won't understand each other. And so the Lord scattered them from there. Can you imagine what that day would have been like? Your foreman is giving you instructions, and all of a sudden, and then you're like, and I imagine there were some fist fights that broke out. You know, somebody gets, speak so I can understand you. And everybody, and so people begin gathering with people they could understand, you know, and so it's like, we're going to stay away from those people. They're crazy over there. And those people back there, they're crazy too. And so the confusion is everywhere, and so they stopped. Now, despite the fact that some of the commentators, and I tend to think too, that Nimrod was behind this, there is some thought that this didn't stop Nimrod. He continued with his rebellion. He continued in trying to lead people away from the true God. Well, the latter part of chapter 11 now tells us about Shem's family line. Now, Shem's family line is important because this is the line of Christ. And that's why we're going to track it even further. So when you look, it says, 2 years after the flood, when Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arphaxad. And after he became the father of Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and had other sons and daughters. Hopefully, it won't be this coming Wednesday, but the following Wednesday, I'm going to have a slide I want to show you. It shows how long people lived. It shows you who would have interacted with each other and who would have known each other. And you were going to be amazed to see Shem sticks on. He had enough in him, I guess, of the pre-flood world that he lives for another 500 years after the flood and outlives many of his children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on. But anyway, Shem lives for 500 years, has other sons and daughters. Arphaxad, at the very young age of 35, has a child. And after he became the father of Shelah, Arphaxad lived 403 years. And so that's only 438 years. He would have died before his dad died. When Shelah had lived 30 years, he became the father of Eber. And after he became the father of Eber, Shelah lived 403 years, had other sons and daughters. Then Eber lived 34 years, became the father of Peleg. And after he became the father of Peleg, Eber lived 430 years. You notice the age is going down. Now, his just jumped up because he lived 403 years later, or longer. But now, as you keep reading, Peleg lived 30 years, became the father of Reu. And after he became the father of Reu, Peleg lived, 209 years. What a drop there. When Reu had lived 32 years, he became the father of Serug. After he became the father of Serug, Reu lived 207 years and had other sons and daughters. When Serug had lived 30 years, he became the father of Nahor. And after he became the father of Nahor, Serug lived 200 years and had other sons and daughters. When Nahor had lived 29 years, he became the father of Terah. And after he became the father of Terah, Nahor lived 119 years. Now, Nahor actually died before, Nahor and Peleg both died before Noah did. Isn't that something? They died before Noah did. Now, Terah, after he lived 70 years, became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And now we're coming right up to Abram. And this is the account of Terah's family line. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans. That's probably the area where the Tower of Babel had been, where Nimrod's kingdom had been. And so it says that Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans in the land of his birth. Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. And so Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and they set out from Ur the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years, and he died in Haran. So that brings us right up to the beginning. So when we get together again 2 weeks from now, we'll be right into the life of Abraham, which is, I had thought maybe we could do Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob on one on each night, but there's just too much in the life of Abraham. So we may not get out of Abraham. So
is that the first time that they spoke of marriage?
Actually calling it marriage, it may be.
Right.
It was practiced before. They had wives before, but this may be the only time. Yeah, that's interesting that you caught that. You're probably right. I'll check into that, but I think you're probably right. It's probably the first time marriage is actually talked about. The concept, man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, that was all the way back in Genesis 1, but that probably is the first time that married. It's the first time I think of it, so very possibly. Any other questions or comments? All right.
We don't have a test on the age and the people, do we?
Yeah, right. No. How old was Noah when he died?